All right, hello. So this is a presentation for my short story collection assignment. I chose Lost in the Funhouse by John Barth. I considered several other collections, and while there were stories I enjoyed in them, they were either very different stylistically from what I'm trying to go for, or I got two or three stories and I was like, yeah, this is nice, but it's not really something I want to talk about. However, I encountered Lost in the Funhouse for another class. It was assigned to read, but we never got around to discussing it. And as soon as I read that story, I was like, okay, I have to read this whole collection because it's brilliant. The first thing I noticed as I was reading is he makes a couple of direct allusions to Joyce, and also it became apparent very soon that just like James Joyce in Ulysses, he chose to use a common man, Leopold Bloom, and attach mythic ideas to him as opposed to attaching mythic ideas to a prince or a king or a god. I saw Barth doing some very similar things, and that's one of the things I really appreciate about Joyce. And if you're familiar with John Barth and his collection, Lost in the Funhouse, there are a lot of meta elements to it, a lot of places where the author will step forward and talk about fiction and techniques of fiction. There are places in the book where stylistically, like in the Menelaus section, where he starts using a series of quotes every time a new narrator is added to this story within a story. So that's him attempting to show something that we abstractly understand about stories. And he does talk about how literature is limited in terms of its ability to provide abstraction because it is itself. Words are abstractions. We take sounds, we associate them with symbols, we decide those symbols, those sound combinations add up to words, we show those words with symbols, and we have entire writing systems. And that's always been just an idea that's really sticky for me and that really fascinates me about, this thing that we're inspired to do. And then finally, my Gods of Lafayette project. The first book is very episodic because we're dealing with different gods and each one's experience with one of Eros' arrows. For the first, probably 40% of the novel, and then everything comes together. There's a middle portion, and then there's the end. And so there's some episodic parts to it, but there's also a well-constructed frame and a through line. And then the sequel, I'm doing something similar in a slightly different way. And so I just decided, well, that's the style for these books. And since he did that with Lost in the Funhouse, I wanted to look at it as a model for using a frame and then having episodic separation while providing continuity in terms of character and plot, even if you're not necessarily including the same characters. Okay, some background about the author. He's still alive. He'll be 90 in May of next year, according to Wikipedia. According to his publisher, Lost in the Funhouse earned him a nomination for the National Book Award. That was the second time he received one. He wrote it in the 60s, and he was most prolific in the 60s and 70s. I think he had one book come out in the 80s. And then, this quote is another reason why I think I feel such an affinity for his work. I come from a very blue-collar background where, as a reader, I was a freak. As a writer, I'm almost a mythological creature myself. And what he said in this quote, I had to learn from scratch that civilization existed, that literature had been going on. That kind of innocence is the reverse of the exquisite sophistication with which a writer like Nabokov comes to the medium, knowing it already, as if he's been in on the conversation since it began. Yet the innocence that writers like myself have to overcome, if it doesn't ruin us all together, it can become a sort of strength. You're not intimidated by your distinguished predecessors, the great literary dead. I was such a reader as a kid. I read everything from like everything, and it was all on one plane until I got much older. I didn't separate, this is classics and this is just genre. Probably why I write somewhere in between them and fit neatly into neither category. He wrote both short fiction and novels. He is best known for being experimental. He is labeled as a postmodernist. I don't know that I've seen any place where he describes himself as postmodernist, but because the writer steps forward, and in one part of throughout Lost in the Funhouse, he is critiquing his own story as he's writing it. They labeled him postmodernist for that, although I think there are many characteristics of postmodernism which he doesn't exhibit. If he wasn't writing in the 60s, I would probably call him more of a modernist. He has far more in common with Joyce than some of the other postmodern writers I've read, with the exception of David Foster Wallace, who was also heavily influenced by Joyce. So, okay. So it is a linked collection. Though we step into many different personas, we have Echo, we have Menelaus, we have a pair of brothers who are Siamese twins, we have Ambrose. Though there is a difference in personas, there's definitely a sense that we are dealing with the same kind of spiralings of a human mind throughout, and the different ways he's trying to take this abstract medium and turn it into something that can communicate abstractions beyond the definitions that it started out with. And we'll talk specifically about that. I think that's one of the reasons why Welcome to the Funhouse is structured the way it is. Just to hit some quick highlights, the frame tale, which is really an epigraph, is basically a Mobius strip, which that looks like a figure 8, and it turns somewhere from the front side to the back side. But even if you follow it all the way, you can never really identify where that turn is. And he considers that the frame. And we can come back and talk about why that is by the time you get to the end. Night Sea Journey, which was a lot of fun. I was reading it and laughing. It took like a page and a half to get the joke, and then I was laughing all the way through. Is the story about a swimmer who happens to be a sperm on the way to the egg, and his approach of the egg is a moment of terror, an apotheosis, and the cessation of the self. The sperm has to die, fertilizing the egg so that the egg can become the person that will be Ambrose in the next story. Ambrose, his mark, is perhaps one of the most beautiful fiction tales I've ever read. Like, I love many parts of this collection, but Ambrose and his mark, the grandfather gathering up the bees image in that one is one that I keep coming back to, and it's one of the most deliciously perfect images for establishing character. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about that story in detail. Water Message, Petition, and Lost in the Funhouse. Water Message and Lost in the Funhouse are very explicitly about Ambrose, whereas Petition is that story of the Siamese twins. In Water Message, Ambrose, who is, he's kind of slim and bookish and odd and awkward, whereas his older brother Peter is amazing and virile, and he's really athletic and he's good at everything. So that's established in Water Message. In Lost in the Funhouse, we get even more detail about that. So Petition, which is a story placed in between them, is the story of the Siamese twin brothers. And in that story, the smaller brother is on the larger brother's back, and he has, his arms can't reach around and his legs can't reach around, and he can only look over his brother's shoulder. And So he can't experience any life on his own, but he has to witness everything his amazing brother does. I'm pretty sure I've read that story in isolation in some anthology at some point in my education. But where it's placed between Water Message and Lost in the Funhouse makes it very clear that it is about Ambrose and Peter, and it's a really effective way of showing how eclipsed Ambrose felt by his older brother. We will talk about Lost in the Funhouse. Echo, I think, in terms of metafiction, it brings in the mythology, right? Echo from mythology. She's cursed, and she was this brilliant storyteller. She's cursed. She loses her ability to tell her own stories, and after her curse, can only repeat what others have said. And if you read that one, there are a lot of elements in there. I think that, like, one of the tragedies of being a writer is you're always aware that without your craft, many of the truly terrible things that happen in the world could not happen, because we would have to take life as it presents itself, whereas writing really encourages us to be outside of the moment and reestablish the reality we see based on the stories that we know about it, whether that writing is in ancient Samaria, keeping tabulations for who owed you what money, or religious systems that use writing to tell their followers how they're supposed to perceive the world, and that's supposed to override their own experience. All of that would be impossible without writing, because even in the oral tradition, if I'm telling you a story, you're evaluating me when I'm talking to you. When I interact with students, they're not just getting what I have to say, they're getting my whole persona. They get how I interact with them, and that allows them to be more evaluative of my words and to question my authority and credibility in a way that the printed word has automatic authority. And I think that one of the poignancies both Barth and I share is that we love the written word, but we've been given so much, and it has led us to so much, but it has also imprisoned large parts of Western civilization. Double-sided coin. And the final three, life story is extremely poignant. It's about a relationship that is struggling to stay together because one of the people in the relationship is so consumed by their art that he forgets to maintain the relationship with his wife. And as somebody who spends many, many, many hours writing, and when I'm in that place, find other people unnecessary and often an aggravation, that one was very poignant for me as well. And the way he would leave out words like their names or like the most definite things they said, he would fill in the blank. And it was amazing that you always could fill in the blank, but by leaving that blank and not giving us the abstraction and forcing us to rely on our own awareness of how the world works, I feel like that's one way he chose in that story to make an abstraction communicate a different abstraction. And he did that by taking away the word we're expecting. Menelaus, which is the Menelaus story that I mentioned earlier, where Menelaus is telling a story, and then it becomes a story within a story within a story within a story. And each time we go through this telescope of story, he adds another set of quotation marks. So as you get towards the end, there's like 7 sets of quotation marks around each sentence. And it's entertaining. The story itself is entertaining because it's all about how Menelaus managed to win Helen of Troy back to his bed after the Iliad. And it has a lot about what Helen of Troy was doing, both before, during, and after the Trojan War. It brings in the perspectives of Clytemnestra and Orestes. It mentions but does not name Iphigenia, which is the daughter that Agamemnon killed in order to get a good sailing wind in the Odyssey. And so these stories within a story brings in both the salacious aspect of all of these relations, but there's also this undercurrent of Menelaus as a trickster which is kind of funny because he gets pretty much no credit for agency in the Iliad or the Odyssey. It's everybody else is fighting his battles. He does talk about how Odysseus is such a great con man who probably already slept with Helen anyway. So that was a lot of fun. And then the most touching story was Anonomade. In Anonomade, you have a musician who was part of Clytemnestra's court. And before Agamemnon leaves, he tells this musician that his job is to make sure Clytemnestra doesn't take any lovers while he's gone, which seems like a pretty big job for someone who's not even involved in all of that. But he's the greatest storyteller of his time. But then the lover that Clytemnestra took, he sees our minstrel or our musician as competition because Clytemnestra loves music and he may or may not suspect. Oh, and he wants the woman that the musician is with. And so Clytemnestra's lover takes him out and strands him on this deserted island where there's 9 amphors of wine and a bunch of sheep. And so he lives, and he names each one of the amphors of wine after one of the muses. And so he'll drink one, and he kills a sheep, and then he writes on the sheep's vellum. And eventually he puts the sheep's vellum in the amphors, casts them out to sea. And he does this a bunch of times. He writes these brilliant, brilliant things. But then he loses his sense of what he wanted to say. He becomes disillusioned, and he ceases to write. And in that moment, a cask, and he has lost so much that he can't remember if it's his own cask or if someone else's has found its way to him. And he opens it up, and those words reinvigorate him. As a writer, I've had the experience where another writer's words have, saved me personally, and that's good because I'm happy I'm, alive and here and doing what I do. But professionally just led me to like this great sea of inspiration that I've been able to draw from over and over and over again to create. And in fact, after reading that line, after finishing the collection, in the author's notes, he talks about the psychopathology of everyday life. And that's the name of the blog of an author that I know a little bit and I really like. He used to live in Denver. He's from Northern Ireland. He moved to Australia. He's just kind of seeing a resurgence because he was about ready to quit writing when he became an Uber driver. A long time ago, he gave me a blurb for my first novel. And so on Twitter, I was like, hey, Adrian, it's Adrian McKenty. I was like, hey, Adrian, I tweeted something along the lines of, because I knew he had read this, from that one illusion, which is, how we as writers find each other in some ways. And I was like, thank you. The amphors that come back to my island, Joyce is one, Toni Morrison was one because Toni Morrison had died the day before, and also you, because he said so many things that are really encouraging about being persistent with writing. And so Anonomade was one that just lifted me up and made me glad, despite all of the bittersweetness of what writing does culturally. It made me glad that I'm so attached to it individually. So that's a very brief overview. And we'll go to the quotes here in just a second. So come on for a second here, talk about that. Okay, so let's go to the quotes that I pulled. I could have highlighted this entire book. I managed not to, but it was a close thing. One thing that can drive even the first part of a conventional metaphor to this. No, that's not one, this one. I don't believe literature is ever likely to manage abstraction successfully. We talked about that one. He talks about how sculpture, you're using something that exists in the real world to create something that exists in the real world that looks like an abstraction. I used to go hiking with an art teacher, and she'd be like, do you see the creature as we passed a chunk of wood? And once she said that, I could see the creature in the wood. First order reality. and he kind of talks about linear plot and that it's out of fashion, which it was in the 1960s, but how he's still kind of attached to it, even though he doesn't think it goes far enough. He doesn't like self-consciousness. Okay. This is all just him writing about writing. There's a quote in here where he talks about autobiography as self-creation, is the word, as opposed to recording oneself. So he sees it as a way to create, which is true, right? Stories are all this artificially created sense of wholeness and completeness, and the idea that there's a beginning, middle, and an end. Our lives only look like that if we've told a story to someone, right? If we don't tell it, Tennessee Williams called it witnessing, right? If somebody doesn't witness for us or witness our lives back to us, we don't really see the events as important. And with the highs and lows, we just kind of see everything as the road we're on. And so stories kind of help us frame our own experience and define meaning in it. So if we're telling stories about ourselves in an autobiography, we are creating a version of ourselves that is different from the actual self. And that's one of the things I appreciate about kind of his version of postmodernism or experimental fiction, or just really trying, I think he's just really trying to see how what he does works, right? Is that there's a sincerity in there, a struggle to understand, as opposed to what so much experimental fiction written in the 1960s did, which was define for you how you're supposed to think and what you should or more often should not believe. So that's probably one of the reasons why I like him better than some of the other postmodernists. Had to highlight the quote from Shakespeare. Remember the higher expenses of spirit and waste of shame. And that's from one of the sonnets. I'm usually thinking that when I walk into a faculty meeting. Okay. This is all still early in the collection. I think this is actually probably still in what I want to get to. I'm just going to use the mouse because it's faster. Is the Ambrose Mark story. Yep, this is all still. Maybe I didn't highlight as much as I thought. Yeah, this is all from the end. Let me go back. Let's just start with let's see. Okay, this isn't working as well as it does on my home one. So let's talk a little bit about Ambrose and his mark. In Ambrose and his mark, we get the establishing shot of Ambrose's life, which is this. There's a pretty strong, we find out later that his brother Peter looks just like one of his uncles. And this uncle is like the big, brash, almost bullying type of uncle. And if you only read Welcome to the Funhouse in isolation, then it's not nearly as clear what's going on in Welcome to the Fun, or in Lost in the Funhouse. So let me go to the table of contents here. Oh yeah, and there's also the mention of Boccaccio, which I think is also stylistically similar. In the Decameron, you have 100 related stories, and it's framed by 10 young people who are still healthy, fleeing from the Black Death. And what they do to keep their spirits up and amuse themselves is they take turns each telling a story a day, so that's 10 stories a day. They elect a king and queen, so it's very democratic for, pre-Renaissance Italy, thanks to the Black Death, probably. And each one of particularly the male characters in the Decameron, they each represent something specific. And so they almost always tell something that's consistent with their name, although there's one character who's kind of the wild card and he tells whatever story he wants. And over the course of the Decameron, it's really about what gives meaning to life and why you would continue to struggle and prize life even after seeing all of the death and destruction that Boccaccio gives a very detailed and forensic analysis of at the beginning. The Black Death and what happened in Italy just before Boccaccio inspired Dante, and on and on and on, pretty much began the Western literature tradition, which I'm sure you know, but the mention of Boccaccio just made me really happy. Okay, so Ambrose and his mark. All right, so Ambrose's father, assuming that his father is the father presented in Lost in the Funhouse, has been committed because he was asking questions about who Ambrose's real father is, and that's because Mom, you can't really call her a free spirit, except she's more narcissistic, and it's funny that they talk about Narcissus, or that Barth brings Narcissus in as a character and Echo Narcissus. Probably not accidental. And somewhere else in here, he also says that the closer you are to writing autobiography, the further away your point of view should be, so the more distant your narration should be, which is another one of the keys to the collection. Okay, so his mother was a bit of a kind of free spirit narcissist-ish, and she's breastfeeding Ambrose, and she's all about just pulling out her breast wherever. She goes out of her way to embarrass Ambrose's Uncle Conrad. There is some suggestion there that maybe Conrad is possibly Ambrose's father, but it becomes extremely clear that his brother Peter is his uncle's son later on. And so, Uncle Carl is Peter's father. So it becomes very clear as the story goes on that this is a tight-knit family, they're immigrants, and they're in kind of competition with the neighbor behind them, right? The heyday of the 20s has given way to the Depression. Fewer materials are more scarce, and Grandpa used to be a brewer, and unfortunately, he no longer has access to honey for brewing his wine, and so he's been coveting his neighbor's bees, and the neighbor is on the back alley, is across the alley in the backyard. And so in order to seduce the bees to come from the neighbor's hives into the hives that Grandpa has just built, he puts a hammock out and sends Ambrose's mother out into the hammock. Now, at this point, Ambrose does not have a name. The mom was expecting a girl. The dad's been committed. And Mom is really like, she's not really worried about baptizing him. Everybody calls him something else, like, hey, baby, or little aunt, they call him. And they're waiting for the child to find his right name. And that's established early. Naming, of course, is a huge trope in mythology. Having an unusual birth, an unusual parenting, and the quest to find a name are typical mythological tropes. And here we have Ambrose, where there's that uncertainty of fatherhood, which happens not only in Christian mythology, but it happens in a lot of places. Like Dionysus is given 3 different mothers, depending on which version of the story you believe. Zeus gets to be everybody's dad because he goes around doing whatever he wants. But like Helen kind of has 2 dads, Zeus being one, and the king who raised her, whose name I've forgotten, ends up being the other. So that's a mythological trope. And then the missing or absent father shows up a lot in mythology and in folklore. And then, of course, the quest for the name. And so she's out there in this hammock, and it's a summer day, and the neighbor likes looking at her, so he's got his binoculars out there, and it gets really hot, and the bees swarm. And they come out of these hives, and they land directly on Ambrose's mother's breast and Ambrose's face, right? And there's this moment of complete panic because out comes the neighbor and he's screaming and yelling and demanding his bees back. Grandpa comes out and he's like old world calm, not worried about anything. And there's this amazing moment where, again, Grandpa steps in and he gathers up these bees. And now this is something I have beekeeping friends that they have heard about, although I haven't talked to anybody who's done it. This idea that bees, when they're swarming, they're not inclined to sting you because they're protecting their queen and they're just trying to huddle together and find a new home. And so you can just pick them up as a swarm with your bare hands and move them. I have a friend who will go out and gather up swarms, but he doesn't do it with his bare hands. And then because the bees had covered Ambrose's eyes and ears, and being covered in bees, it has some mythological associations. I'm pretty sure they're Greek in Greece, so hey, Greek mythology. He has the ability after that to see things that no one else sees, and to hear things that no one else hears. And so that's established in this story, and it finally gives him his name because of St. Ambrose, who is also associated with bees. Okay. And then we get to Lost in the Funhouse. So in that story, we have an establishing shot that shows us Ambrose getting his name. And if you haven't read that, then the first bits of description here in Lost in the Funhouse, you just read them like, wow, he's just giving us some little details. We're not sure what they mean. And we'll just go. So here's one of the first ethereal intrusions in Lost in the Funhouse, where just like in 19th century literature, they're leaving blanks for the names of people and streets and towns. And then he calls out the fact that he's doing this. Initials blanks are both often substituted for proper names. Okay. And this quote right here, I felt like when I So this quote here, interestingly, as with other aspects of realism, it is an illusion that is being enhanced by purely artificial means. And this makes me want to just hug this 90-year-old man. As a writer who uses some genre elements, like I have the Greek gods living in Lafayette, his awareness that realism is itself a constructed illusion intended to create the sense of reality, but is not itself reality, and therefore is just as much a product of the author as more fantastical types of fiction. That makes me feel really good because I'm in between kind of literary and genre. I'm very keenly aware of the prejudices that show up in both. When I'm around straight genre readers, they don't understand what I'm doing either, and they don't have patience for some of the more literary things I do. So we get to this quote about their mother sitting in the middle of the front seat like Magda in the second, only with her arms on the seat back behind the men's shoulders. Because we have Uncle Carl, Peter's dad, on one side, which is implied, never explicitly explained, and then Ambrose's dad, who is driving the car. And Ambrose's dad is described with the key detail of being a man who can light a match with his thumb and apply that to a cigarette all with one hand while keeping the other hand on the wheel. And so we get the intrusion of the author. Description of physical appearance and mannerisms is one of several standard methods of characterization used by writers of fiction. So we're alternating between the story and then the author teaching how to write a story, and then he'll later be critiquing the story at the same time. Okay. And he talks about, like this right here is a master class. These couple of paragraphs are basically a class on how to effectively use sensory detail in fiction. He talks about making sure you use multiple senses so that you are triangulating the character in the reader's mind. And he's doing that, and then he tells you that, and then he does that, and that adds even more emphasis on the characterization of Ambrose's parents, so he never has to come out and say whose father is whose. It is clearly implied by the description. And then they get to stimulated by the briny sperm, which is a callback to the sperm on its way to the egg story that begins the collection. And then, of course, how do I not love an author that then talks about Joyce's sense of the sea in Ulysses and the use of the adjective snot green and scrotum tightening. And then he critiques Joyce, like, look, it's visual, auditory, tactile, and olfactory. And then we get to the description of Ambrose's father. And then he even says, let's see, maybe John can remove the action, for example, or be particularly appropriate to the sensibility of the narrator, even hinting to the reader things of which the narrator is unaware. So this is really fun, right? Because it's an autobiography told in episodic parts intended to show different parts of the author's consciousness. And the idea that when writing an autobiography, you are as much creating yourself as, or probably more creating yourself than telling about yourself. And here he's talking about how the sense of discovery that in writing about this, the reader is going to become aware of things that the narrator doesn't know, which maybe means that Barth didn't know this about himself until he started writing it. And that, of course, rings really true. Uncle Carl's face resembled Peter's, rather vice versa. Both had dark hair and eyes, short, husky statures, deep voices. Because we've been given all of this information about how authors use characterization, this bit of characterization and description really stands out, especially since it's followed up with the boy's father is difficult to describe. And that becomes a double entendre, right? Because, the boys. See, this was another key piece. It's not B-O-Y-S apostrophe, implying multiple boys. It was the boy, so one of the boys' father is difficult to describe. Uncle Carl is a complete creeper. He's going to make a bunch of sexual comments to 14-year-old Magda, who is Peter's girlfriend, but whom Ambrose had an uncomfortably adolescent experience with, where they were playing masters and slaves because they grew up in Maryland in the 30s. This is in the 40s after the war had started, and so it would have been the early 1940s. And it doesn't say exactly what happened to them, but the description implies that maybe Magda gave him oral sex, which as an adult reader you're really uncomfortable with, but also you really want to know if that's what happened, because he leaves that blank, and he leaves it blank all the way through and never comes back and actually answers it. And I think that's a really effective technique, because if he told you what happened, then it becomes that defined thing. Whereas when he leaves it open, he leaves that window open into everyone's adolescence. And so you start looking in based on your own experience and reacting to that. He doesn't describe what happened, what Magda did, but he describes everything around it, which is kind of triangulation like a picture negative, as opposed to painting the picture, which I really enjoy. Okay. So about this point, he starts criticizing his inability to tell Lost in the Funhouse in an appropriate way. This should happen at the beginning. Look, your beginning's gone on too long, nothing's happened yet. The middle should narrate all relevant events, and then you should get to an end. And he keeps circulating back to that, like, man, I can't believe you guys are still reading this, because it's not really, I'm not telling the story the way it should be told. And then we have Mom pushing Uncle Carl's shoulder in mock annoyance, and we have the italics to tell us that she really likes it. We have Uncle Carl and Peter threaten to throw Magda into the sea, and she gets kind of mock angry about it. And then you get this long description about what's happening under the boardwalk, and we get the idea that at some point Ambrose was exploring under the boardwalk looking for matchbooks, and he saw a sailor and a woman having sex, and that caused him to throw up. So in this part of Welcome to the Funhouse, between his memories of Magda, who he still kind of has a bit of a crush on, but she is his brother's girlfriend, we have this story, we have that, and we have this other sexual experience, and there's this awareness of something that has happened between his mother and at least two of these brothers. And he is 13, so he's got his own puberty things going on. So we have that idea of sexuality, and it gets lost with this inward turning beach and funhouse imagery. He goes into the funhouse, he gets separated from Peter and Magda. He doesn't realize that the funhouse is supposed to be for lovers. Like, you go into the funhouse so you can find a dark corner and smoochy face. So he invites Magda, doesn't get upset when Peter follows. Peter and Magda leave him behind, and he wanders off by himself and no one can find him. And the story ends with him still lost. So he makes up a possible ending, but it's clear that that's not what happened. Yeah, that's him talking about story patterns. And then the story ends like this, right? He envisions a truly astonishing funhouse, incredibly complex, yet utterly controlled from a great central switchboard like the console of a pipe organ. Nobody had enough imagination. He could design such a place himself, wiring and all, and he's only 13 years old. He would be its operator. Panel lights would show what was up in every cranny of its cunning, of its multifarious vastness. A switch flick would ease this fellow's way, complicate that, to balance things out. If anyone seemed lost or frightened, all the operator had to do was... He wishes he had never entered the funhouse, but he has. And he wishes he were dead, but he's not. Therefore, he will construct funhouses for others and be their secret operator, though he would rather be among the lovers for whom funhouses are designed. Right? So in Ambrose's mark, Ambrose is established as a character who can see too many things, kind of see what's really going on past everyone's pretensions and the convenient lies they tell themselves. He can't help but see. And then here in this story, we have Ambrose seeing too much. And then he gets lost in this funhouse. And from this point on, the funhouse is, yes, him getting lost within himself, but also becoming the designer of funhouses, the storyteller. Stories are like a funhouse. You get lost within it. You weave around through all of the events of a story. And when you come out, if the story has touched something within you, you are transformed. And even if you're not transformed, you had some kind of fun, whether it was enjoyment or intellectual stimulation. And so he decides he's going to build these stories for others. So there's that professional launching, but also this personal contracting. Because he's lost in the funhouse, there's always going to be a significant barrier between him and the rest of the world. So from this story on, which is at the midpoint in terms of numbering, it's the 7th story, but the stories that come after it are all much longer. So it's like the first third of the collection. Everything he says has to be seen through the lens of being in the funhouse. So here's Echo and Narcissus, and there's a little bit of Oedipus. Self-discovery is fatal, and this self-discovery has been, if not fatal, at least confining for Ambrose. Okay. All right. This is fun because it's a bunch of different similar themes, different places, and then we have the title. This is a lot more of that how to write or what writing is doing, but now we're veering off, right? It's not a straight instruction manual. Now we're veering off as, okay, these are my abstractions for communicating my abstractions. How do I use these abstractions? But everything's like one step off of just informational. So now our abstractions, like words and story structure, become symbols for what's happening in the narrator's mind and his inability to interact with the world. Which is incredibly fun. And we go here. And I just want to, I'll show you one picture of the use of quotes in Menelade. Okay. So if we get a little bit further in here, we'll start seeing. So here we have quote, this is a quote within a quote within a quote. So there's 3. And then we have even an exclamation point, which is a reaction. So his how they reacted. And this one is actually really interesting because, so long tail to short, too short to toss, then the trouble started. And so we have a quotation and then we have a quote within 2 parentheses, which then is followed up by 3 exclamation point, 2 exclamation point, 2 exclamation point, and that's within a bracket, and that's within a bracket. As if the trouble, either these are reactions or these are different troubles that are all compounding upon each other, and that's shown just with the punctuation. Try holding an armful of ocean, which if you think about who we are as we grow older shifts and changes, trying to hold another person is very much like trying to hold an ocean. This one is really entertaining, just in terms of imagery. And then we have parentheses and a bunch of quotes. Here we're up to inner quote, quote, inner quote, quote. So 4. Then we're at 5. I thought we made it up to 8. Oops, still just 5. Oh, 5. So I guess it's only 5 deep. That still seems like a lot. Okay, love is easy to be loved as if one were real, on the order of others, a fearsome mystery. Because one of the things that happens to our narrator over time is, and then look, we have this love, quotation mark, love, exclamation point, question mark, exclamation, question, exclamation, question, exclamation, question, right? What is love? At this point, over time, our narrator, especially in the one about the man and his wife, he's begun to doubt his own reality. In that tale, he uses kind of syllogistic axiomatic thinking, where if this, then that, if this, then that, to ultimately arrive at the only absurdity, the most absurd thing in all of this absurdity is that he is real, and so he kind of proves his own reality by seeing his own absurdity. Yeah, that was Life Story. And then Anonymade. I just want to get to the very end of Anonymade. Okay. He's talking about sending off his last cask, his last inspiration, his last muse, because he's drinking it, and all of the wine was bitter in this last cask. And the sheep he killed was old, so the vellum is more brittle and also smaller because there was less of it that was usable. And he writes the last thing he knows and he sends it out. And he talks about talents and statues fall, gods come and go, new worlds and tongues swim into light, old perish, then it too must perish, with all things deciphered and undeciphered, men and women, stars and sky, what he had written. Will anyone have learned its name? Will everyone? No matter. Upon this noontime of his wasting day, between the night past and the long night to come, a noon beautiful enough to break the heart, on a lorn fair shore, a nameless minstrel wrote it. I don't know why that wrote it off by itself. It just gives me chills. But I think the desire to write comes from a desire to understand oneself and present the stories that come to you to the world, and whether or not they outlast you, you want them to be born, you want them to be read, which goes back to some of the birth imagery at the very beginning of the book. And maybe someday somebody, they may not know who he was, but they might find his words. And even if they don't, he exists in that noon between the long night of the past and the long night of the future. He exists in that beautiful noon where he wrote it. And that brings back, audience aside, the greatest joy of writing is the writing and seeing these characters evolve and create themselves. And that without you there listening to them, they wouldn't exist in the way that you have created them. The author's note is also worthwhile because he goes back to what he said at the beginning, which is how many multimedias you would need if you really wanted to represent what was going on. And then again, there it is. The title autobiography means self-composition. So he's composing himself as he's attempting to write about himself. The antecedent of the first person pronoun is not I, but the story. So even if you're writing your own autobiography, you are not the subject the story is. You are, I am its father, its mother is the recording machine, and the story is the child that exists in between them. Just like Ambrose is, his mother is the recording machine, she gives birth. The father is the sperm from the night swim story. And so even though all of this is very fantastic, told with many different narrators, once you get past the Lost in the Funhouse, the stories cease to follow any linear line or conform to any traditional idea of the story. And all of that is intended by this author to be his autobiography. He started off talking about how the linear nature of stories in Freytag's pyramid are ineffective in terms of representing actual life. They are an abstraction that expects stories to conform to their abstraction. They are not abstractions that do an effective job of recreating reality. Lost in the Funhouse takes the twists and turns that it does, because in Barth's mind, that is far more realistic for how an actual human mind and life works, which goes back to Joyce, why he was writing in stream of consciousness, because we don't all think in well-composed paragraphs where the beginning of each sentence has a consistent subject, and you have the clincher anchor statement at the end. But our thoughts are fragmentary, scattered, and not always worthy of being recorded for posterity, but they are still ours. They are still part of our humanity. And I think this is intended to present that same idea. Language may be a compound code, in that the discovery of an enormous complexity beneath a simple surface may well be more dismaying than delightful. The maze of termite tunnels in your Joyce, the intricate cancer in her perfect breast, the psychopathology of everyday life. This idea that we don't always want complexity. In fact, most people, most of the time, are looking for ways to simplify things. The professions in our culture that make the most money are reductive ones. Science and math, you take real things and you turn them into abstract numbers, right? 6 people, the number 6 becomes more important than the people and implies that they're all the same thing, although any 6 people are radically different from each other. And science, which takes these complex arrays of experience in life and simplifies them into variables and processes and seeks to narrow down and only look at one thing at a time. The search for complexity is really only done by, like, even psychology, you're reducing people down to their disorders quite often. If you really want to explore and establish complexity, you almost always need a literary author to do that for you. They don't make any money, but you get to tell interesting truths. And then I really love this ending, even though I've not looked up that word, the deuterogenous of life story. Antecedent of the second person pronoun is you, right? And when I read that, I was like, you can have the means of communication as the mother, and the idea is going into it as the father. The story is a child, but that child has nowhere to go without you, the reader. So I felt like this was Barth really reaching out to his reader. There's several times over the course of the collection where he's like, why are you still here? This is terrible. Get out while you still can. And every time he told me to get out, it just invited me back in. So there was some analysis and just kind of this listing part, and then I focused in on some of the stories that were really sticky in my brain. This is a collection I would want to read probably 2 or 3 more times. A, because it's beautiful, but B, because I feel like in only going through one reading and then just glancing back at the stories, I feel like I barely scratched the iceberg, and that everything he told me is a layer inviting me further in so he can tell me more. So I'll probably read and reread this one. So by creating Ambrose as a mythological figure, which he establishes with Ambrose's birth, suddenly all of these things that happen in the story are just happening to one person. But they're happening to a figure, and what happens to him reshapes the world, and that is true, actually, now that I think about it. What happens to you reshapes your perspective, and therefore reshapes the world as you understand it, which is a big postmodernist idea, so I guess he is edging towards them that way, although he's still way more of a modernist to me. Functional mythology in a modern world, there's a lot of struggle with what ideas do you accept from authority, whether that authority is ancient tomes or whether that authority is kind of flavor of the week fashion that is trying to dictate what literary art should look like. He's really trying to kind of clear both of those away and drill into how you present the depth and meaning in a human life. And then framing stories for a novel-like effect and character and plot movement while maintaining episodic separation. This is kind of a genius work of art for that. It begins and ends with the sea, sperm swimming at the beginning, minstrel casting out his last inspiration and writing onto the sea is another. So it is that Mobius strip, right? So he said it was a Mobius strip. So you enter this world lost in the funhouse by swimming, and then it ends with the story being cast back out on the water, and you see that kind of leading to becoming the place where the sperm swims. And so he fulfills his promise that he makes in the very first story, which is really just a few words, by the end after taking us through all kinds of philosophical twists and turns. The stories, the episodic nature of the stories is very complete, even the ones that are all explicitly about Ambrose. Each comes at it from a different direction and leave some of the blanks in there. So it's like finding those key jewel moments that really represent Ambrose's experience. But then abstracting that further and comparing it to Siamese twin, or Echo and Narcissus, or Menelaus, and is that Telemachus at the table, or is it someone else? By connecting back to those mythological themes, it makes it seem very big, but also contained, because he's operating based off of illusions that he assumes if you've made it that far into his book, you're familiar with, because if all you've ever read is whatever bestseller is on the rack at the grocery store, you are not going to make it through far enough to read the mythological stuff. You kind of have to have that underpinning in all of the writing that has led to this moment, to understand this moment. And some people are like, oh, that's so snobbish when you do that. But anyone can read, right? If you fall in love with reading, you don't need a degree. Like, I was reading things that you can just go get a library card. And so reading is the most democratic form of education. So it's not snobbery, it's just telling you to stop being lazy and go read a book. I might be putting a little bit of my own opinion in there. But we do see consistent character development with Ambrose, because he starts as a sperm, then he's a baby, then he is a prepubescent adolescent, then he's an early puberty adolescent, and then when we get to life story at the end, we see the conflict between this husband and this wife, and there's very much a sense that that is both Ambrose and the author trying to deal with kind of a later in life relationship, and that everything in between has been kind of a phase of his life, even if it's not explicitly about him. And there's also plot movement, right? He begins with literature is an abstraction, how can it effectively communicate abstraction? And by the end, with the Ananame story, it is very, very clear that you understand as a reader this journey that the narrator has made from somebody becoming aware of the world, to somebody becoming aware of writing, to somebody being aware that it's art that sustains us by the end, and then finally with just the joy of creation for creation's sake itself. And so you do see that development of that person, and that is the plot line in an autobiography, and so I feel like that comes through really clearly. Quite honestly, a lot of the things he says about writing, there were things like, oh yeah, I kind of felt that, but you gave me words, so now I can name and claim that. And especially when it comes to editing and making some decisions here and there, coming back to this book, it's like a writing course, just in and of itself, for reminders for how to write effectively, because he's talking about what you're trying to accomplish while you're doing it. Thank you.